Everyone, is this working? Can you hear me? No, yes, now you can. I'm Carolyn Ramo. I'm the Executive Director of Artadia, and thank you so much for being here today. I just wanted to give you guys a very brief introduction about what Artadia does and what this particular program does. So Artadia is a nonprofit organization that is almost 20 years old, and we provide support for visual artists, primarily by giving unrestricted grants. And we've been doing this in Chicago for 17 years. And we've given grants to about 85 artists in Chicago over that time. We have an open call for Chicago artists that happens very soon, next month. So as long as you're not enrolled in art school and you live in Chicago for the past 2 years, you're eligible to apply. So just a little plug for that. And one of the things that we're really interested in is supporting artists beyond the grant and finding a way to connect artists to their community and then outside of their community. So we started a program 3 years ago called Art and Dialogue, where we invite curators to come to one of our 7 cities, do studio visits with artists and award artists, and then also do a public program. So the idea is that artists are then able to meet curators that they wouldn't necessarily have access to, and of course that we all get to hear from curators that have very important voices in the field. So just wanted to say thank you very much to SAIC. We're really excited to be partnering with you all. And then you're going to introduce Lauren.
Hi, my name is Adia Sykes, and I'm one of the graduate curatorial fellows over at Sullivan Galleries with the Department of Exhibitions. So first of all, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We're thrilled to have Lauren Haynes here with us in Chicago. Lauren Haynes is curator of contemporary art at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas, and co-curator of the upcoming exhibition, The Beyond, Georgia O'Keeffe and Contemporary Art, opening at the museum in May. As a scholar of modern and contemporary African American art, she curated many exhibitions in her almost decade-long tenure at the Studio Museum in Harlem, such as Speaking of People, Ebony, Jet, and Contemporary Art, Stanley, Whitney, Dance the Orange, and Carrie Mae Weems' The Museum series. She has authored and co-authored several catalogues such as Alma Thomas, The Bearden Project, Speaking of People for the Whitney Museum, and contributed catalog essays for the Studio Museum exhibitions Harlem, A Century in Images, and Gordon Parks' A Harlem Family, 1967. Haynes is also a member of the Association of Art Museum Curators and serves on the Nomination and Governance Committee. She is the recipient of the 2016 Gold Rush Award from the Rush Philanthropic Arts Foundation. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Artadia. Thank you, SAIC. Thank you, Adia, for that amazing introduction. Just so you all know, I am getting over a bit of a sinus thing, so I'm a little congested, but we're going to make it. It's going to be good. So I thought what we could do is I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how I got to where I am, what I'm working on, but I also want to leave it up to you all to ask questions if there's any sort of burning something that you want to know that I probably won't know the answer to, but I will do my best to sort of get us there. Does that sound good? Great, okay. So to start, just a little bit, a question that I often get, and I think a lot of us who work in the arts get, is sort of how did you get there? Particularly as I am not a visual artist, I don't have training as a visual artist. I'm a curator. I did take photography classes when I was little, not because I thought I was going to be the next great photographer, but I really was obsessed with this idea of darkroom photography and developing film and developing prints. But that was really my first exposure until I got to college. I went to Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. Oberlin has an amazing museum, the Allen Memorial Art Museum. When I got to college, like many of us, I think I needed a work-study job, and I was sort of looking around on, I assume it was online at that point, it wasn't that long ago, but, and the database for jobs that were opening, and there was one at the museum, and I wasn't exactly sure what that meant because I didn't grow up going to museums. I was born in East Tennessee. We moved to New York when I was 13, so I think I sort of missed that school group age in New York going to all the museums, so I didn't have that as an experience. But I thought I could do it, photocopies, whatever it was. But what I didn't expect was to sort of fall in love with the museum, and not just the objects and the art, but also the behind the scenes aspect of it. So when I was there, the director of the Allen was a woman named Sharon Patton. And for those of you who don't know, Sharon Patton was an amazing scholar of African American art history, and really one of the sort of leading voices, along with people like Lowry Stokes Sims, for African American women in the field. And so to see her as the director, that was my first experience at a museum, and so I didn't realize till much later that that was an oddity, right? That most museums do not have Black women as their directors. So that was a great experience. And I also fell in love with the collection that Oberlin has, particularly works like this by Alison Sarr, and this work by Rashid Johnson, Jonathan with Hands. So this is, for everyone who in this room I'm sure is familiar with Rashid's work, this is very different than what he does now and sort of what he's come to do, but these photographs were the first things that I saw, and really I was just sort of blown away by them, and really it helped me get to this point of wanting to take art history classes and to study and to really get an understanding of what that meant. And I knew I wanted to work in a museum, so throughout college I did the things, I did internships, had different projects at different museums, and I quickly ruled out certain things. I knew I did not want to work in museum education because children frighten me. They are adorable, but they frighten me. And so then I sort of started thinking about the curatorial field and thinking about what that would mean. And so after I graduated, I was lucky enough to get a job at the Brooklyn Museum, working for Terry Carbone in the Department of American Art. Very basic level, entry level job, but again, loving this museum, loving the art, loving just everything that was going on. But I also quickly realized that the Brooklyn Museum was a museum that you didn't necessarily move up in, and I wasn't quite at the point where I thought about going back to grad school. So I was looking around for other jobs and saw a position as a curatorial assistant at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And for any person interested in African American art history, the Studio Museum is the place where you want to be, where you are drawn to. So to be able to sort of get a position there was obviously life-changing, but also really life-affirming in that, you study, you all are in school, you understand this, you're studying, you're doing something, and you believe that you can do it and you have something to say, but to actually get the chance to do it, it's amazing. And so at the Studio Museum, where I worked for almost 10 years, I got to do a lot with the collection. And really, the Studio Museum is a museum that was founded in 1968 by a group of artists and supporters who really wanted to make a space for Black artists to show their work. It was in a lofted building in Harlem in the very beginning, and then moved to its current location in the 80s, and now is in the process of being closed because they're getting a brand new building. But the collection is eclectic. So they're amazing, everything, all of it's amazing, but there's some things like the Barclay Hendricks Lodi Mama, which is just one of the most iconic works in the collection. And then in the back you see a work by Kehinde Wiley that he made while he was in residence at the museum. And so a work like that, again, if you look at it closely, you can sort of see hints of what we come to know as Kehinde's work now, but one of the great things about the Studio Museum's collection, because of the amazing residency program that the Studio Museum has, you get to see works of these artists who go on to do amazing things, but at really different and interesting points in their career. And this is just some images of different shows that I worked on, Spiral, and the Bearden Project. So this was an exhibition that came together to celebrate what would have been Bearden's 100th birthday had he lived. So we got the idea that we wanted to ask 100 artists to create collages in honor and inspired by Bearden. Now, 100 artists is a lot, and to sort of ask 100 artists to make a collage, which was really the only guidelines that we gave. We weren't saying that you had to make anything specific. We sent them the paper. Some of them chose to use it. As you can see, Simone Lee, you see a work by her in the front. She did not use the paper. And then you see other things, but it was really, we were expecting that and really excited by the exhibition. This is a work by Carolyn Harris, and she created inspired by her interest in Bearden as well as her interest in Samuel Delaney. And more works, some by Chanel Abney, right there. And you just, for a project like that, it was one of those sort of curatorial dreams, but also a curatorial nightmare in a way, because you don't know what you're gonna get, right? You don't know when it's gonna come. You sort of ask for it on a certain timeline. Not everything came back in time, so really this exhibition lasted over 3 exhibition seasons. It was only supposed to happen for 1, but we worked it out because a small museum could sort of rotate and really have that happen. And another show, the Studio Museum is well known for a series that's sort of become known, the F series, which looks at emerging artists. And I co-curated with Naima Keith and Thomas Lax 4, which was the 4th one. But so sort of a play on the word for, as we can see, and these are some images from that. And also some works from the collection, this work by Fred Wilson. And more, of course. And really with this, just wanting to show and talk about really the depth of work and the experiences that I got at the Studio Museum, because it's a small museum, small institution, but really given the ability to do so much and work with artists at all different stages in their career really helped me articulate and become a little bit more clear about what I think of curating means, right? And why working with primarily living artists is sort of what I'm most interested in, because I think when you're able to have the conversations with artists, even especially artists like Carrie Mae Weems, you're talking to her, asking her if you can do a show of her work, and then having her really go in the process with you, a person who has been doing this for so long and has so much to offer to the world. It's a really exciting experience. This was an exhibition, speaking of people that looked at the way artists used Ebony and Jet magazines in their work and their practice. So really a great mix of works, like these sculptures by Leslie Hewitt, as well as the photo by David Hart in the back. And then Ellen Gallagher's Deluxe in the background. And this work by Hank Willis Thomas, which was there was a feature in Jet magazine called Beauty of the Week. And he took every single Beauty of the Week and sort of made an installation that goes from, as you can sort of see, the black and white images to the color images. And this was the exhibition happened at an interesting time, because soon after the exhibition opened, Jet went from actually printing to being an online only publication. So really seeing that this project couldn't exist up to that point, it really stopped and there was no more of it happening. This was an exhibition, Stanley Whitney. Another, I will say, sort of great thing and thing that I find sort of key to what I'm thinking about is how we talk about artists, right? So how do we think about artists at all points in their careers, and artists who sometimes we say are sort of underrepresented or underdiscovered or sort of left behind. And there are all these reasons that can happen. The market, curators, liking certain artists, just there's a lot of reasons. So particularly I found with a lot of African-American artists of a certain generation, if there are a few that we can sort of all name and think about and sort of go to, but one of the things at the Studio Museum that we were able to do was to know more artists and really be a space and a place for them to have a voice. So Stanley Whitney is an artist who is based in New York City, but also spends a lot of time in Parma, Italy. And Stanley, as you can see, is an abstract artist. And for a long time, he was a teacher, and he split his time between New York and Italy. And Italy was really where most of his market was, right? Where his work was sort of accepted and sort of seen. But he also, he taught at Tyler in Philadelphia. And so many artists that you come to know were his students. So you sort of see that lineage, but then you also see this amazing work and this amazing person who usually spends the summers in Italy, but we talked to him about doing this exhibition, and he actually said, all right, I'll stay so he can do this work. And it was a great exhibition, not only because the works looked fantastic in this space, but it really allowed us to have this conversation about abstraction and an artist who's still working in abstraction and has been continuing to work in abstraction throughout his career. and I always like to put this picture because he is usually extremely well dressed as always. Also collection shows, some of the last ones that I did at the Studio Museum. Also did a project with Ebony G. Patterson in the Studio Museum's project space. And this is from an exhibition we did with Richard Hunt when we got to go to his studio. I don't know if any of you have actually been to Richard's studio. It is an amazing, huge space where he is sort of occupied for several decades, and you can sort of see the layers of that, and that I don't think Richard throws anything away. He has newspapers from all over, but also his work, and just sort of, he allowed us to come into the studio and really come up with an exhibition based on works that hadn't been shown in a while, combined with some works from the Studio Museum's collection. And so the last big exhibition that I did at the Studio Museum was called Alma Thomas. It was co-organized with Ian Barry at the Tang Museum at Skidmore, and it was a look at the work of Alma Thomas, who was an artist who I was often drawn to, particularly the Studio Museum had a few small drawings in the collection. And after, when I first started, getting to know her work more and just being fascinated by her story and the work that she made. So Alma Thomas was a woman who lived in Washington, D.C. She was born in Columbus, Georgia, moved to D.C. when she was very young, and started always very interested and active in the art scene, but never really dedicating her life to it. She was a junior high school art teacher, and then when she retired at the age of 68, that's when she started making her own work. And this was in the 60s, right? The sort of late 60s, and she became very fascinated with making the works that she wanted to make. She often said, you know, I want to make happy paintings. I'm not so much worried about if people like them, I'm making them for me. She was fascinated by her garden and this idea of what would her garden look like from space. She talked about being born in the horse and buggy days and then living to see man walk on the moon. So just really what that meant to her career and the work that she made. And Alma Thomas was the first African-American woman to have a solo show at the Whitney Museum. This was in 1972. And these works, really that she showed, this was at the moment in the 70s where a lot of institutions were starting to sort of get a lot of pushback for the fact that they weren't showing black artists. So institutions across the country, including LACMA, the Whitney, started having small shows, often one artist in a smaller gallery, but really sort of bringing artists to the fore to that conversation. I think there was a lot of mixed impact of those shows, right? So people were happy that they were happening, but there was also this question of, well, why are they happening in this small space, or why are they only happening now, and how are you deciding? So it's, I think, a conversation that the impact we're still seeing and thinking about. This was just part of the process of us laying out the catalog and looking at all of the images together and some of the great things that we found in the archives. So about a year and a half ago, time sort of flies, but about a year and a half ago, I took a position at Crystal Bridges to become the curator of contemporary art. And so Crystal Bridges is in Bentonville, Arkansas. I had never been to Arkansas before I went for my interview. And this was a really important decision for me to think about, because I think as curators, as anyone, when you're making a career decision, you're sort of weighing a lot of different factors. I call myself a New Yorker because I lived there most of my life, but New York is an incredibly difficult place to live. So in thinking about where I wanted to go, I was also thinking about place and what that meant, but also wanting to be in an institution that was able to have this conversation about artists of color, female artists, really trying to think about not wanting to tell the traditional story of art history, right? Sort of not just saying, oh, our collection has the greatest hits, or we show these same 7 artists, and aren't we amazing because we have these fantastic works, but really wanting to continue the work that I was able to do at the Studio Museum and my commitment to artists of color, and really wanting to try to think about how do we tell a more exciting story? How do we make sure that kids who come into the museum can see themselves and really understand the possibility of what that means if they want to be an artist, if they don't want to be an artist, if they want to work in a museum, if they don't want to work in a museum, but to make it feel like it's a space for them. So these were all things sort of running through my mind as I was thinking about where could I go, what would my next steps be. And Crystal Bridges, has anyone been to Crystal Bridges here? Okay, well, you all need to come. But it is in Northwest Arkansas, so it's in the Ozarks. So these are some images, and you sort of see it's almost like it was sort of transplanted right in the middle of the woods. So it's a beautiful setting. There are lots of deer, a lot of deer, a lot of outdoor, a lot of animals around, and the New Yorker in me is coming out. It was when I first moved, I walked to work and would walk down this path, and every morning there would be these 3 deer just staring at me, and I was convinced that they were going to like attack me, and everyone's like, Lauren, that's not gonna happen. I was like, do we know that for a fact? It didn't happen yet, but we'll see. But part of the draw of Crystal Bridges is that it celebrates art, architecture, and nature all together. So when you're thinking about the museum and as you're walking through, even as you're walking through the collection, you can sort of look out and see nature. You also are looking at this building that was incredibly designed and built, so it's really an immersive experience. And the collection really has its heft in the early American part of the collection. That's sort of where the museum was founded by the Walton Family Foundation, and that was the founding collection was a lot of early American works, Hudson River School works, different things. But very quickly, the museum opened in 2011. Before it opened, very quickly, the founding curators and team decided that contemporary art was an important part of the mission, an important part of this idea of telling a complete story of American art. So the contemporary program is growing. I was hired about 1.5 years ago to really help think through some of the ideas, and we're even growing more and more hiring. I had an associate curator. We have openings because there's so much happening in the contemporary realm in Bentonville and at the museum. Right now, we have an exhibition up called Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, that was organized by the Tate Modern. And we are the first US venue. It closes with us on April 23rd, so there's still time to come see it. But then it will go to the Brooklyn Museum in September. And this exhibition was one that I was really excited to work on because the works in the exhibition are really looking at works of art by African American artists made between 1963 and 1983, and this idea, the questions that artists were asking. What does it mean to be a black artist? Is there one way to be a black artist, particularly at that moment in time when our country, much like now, was sort of going through this crisis of identity and trying to understand what it means to be black in this country. And the exhibition is divided into 12 different rooms that really looks at either artists who are living and working in the same part of the country or through the same style, or Betty Saar, she is the only artist to have her own solo room. There was an Afrocopra room, so featuring works by these Chicago artists, Jay and Wadsworth Gerald, amongst others. And for me, this exhibition, it was exciting. This exhibition was coming to Crystal Bridges before I started working there. It would have happened even if I wasn't there. But for me, it was exciting to think about because this is work, an artist that I know well. It was a great, I think, introduction for our visitors and for our public to actually have this historic, because 83 was 30 plus years ago, right? So this isn't work that was made recently, though many of these artists continue to make work and the ones that are living are still making work. But it was really setting up this basis to say, here are artists, some of whom you know because they're in the collection, but many of them that you don't know. But let's dispel these myths that you have about what black art is or what art of this moment was, and let's see where these conversations can take us. So I think for me, as a contemporary curator, that's one of the things I think about with each exhibition. How does this exhibition open up something different and lead to the next exhibition, or lead to something that some people may have felt challenged by? Because I think, there are a lot of conversations around Soul of a Nation coming, and people feeling like, oh, is this going to be controversial? Is there going to be pushback? And I was like, well, what would the pushback be exactly. I think, it's one of those exhibitions that you hear a title and you're like, okay, what does that mean? But then when you actually see the work and see the variety of work that these artists are making and the ideas that we're grappling with, there's not really controversy in it. And I think those are the conversations that sometimes institutions get a little nervous about having. But you have to let the art and the artist sort of speak and answer those questions. So right now, the show that I am working on that will open on May 26th is a show called The Beyond, Georgia O'Keeffe and Contemporary Art. And it looks at the work of O'Keeffe alongside 20 contemporary artists who are thinking through some of the same themes. So ideas around the body, ideas of landscape, abstraction, and really it's not meant to make these one-to-one comparisons. So there's not this idea of, oh, this artist has looked at O'Keeffe their whole life and is making works that look like O'Keeffe, but really this idea of we talk about O'Keeffe as being the mother of American modernism and an innovator in so many ways. Well, who are artists who are doing that now? Who are artists who are thinking through these ideas in a really unique way? And for me, and Chad Olligood, who's the co-curator of the show, we talk about the show a little bit as this idea that people are going to come for O'Keeffe. We have some great O'Keeffes in the Crystal Bridges collection, including Jimson Weed. People love it when it's not up. They ask where it is. They want to know when it's coming back. So this idea, how do you sort of take that appeal, take that work, or take that object that someone wants, the artist that people love and will come see, to think about how do you then show them what I'm most excited about, what you think they're going to be most excited about. How do you sort of introduce artists, all of whom had never shown at Crystal Bridges, many of whom have never shown at a museum before, to really expand this conversation and to have it be a group of artists that really represent what we're trying to do. So having it be artists that are from all across the country, different backgrounds, different ages, but really all thinking through different ideas. So there are 20, but just some images and some names: Sharon El Salaf, Loe Hollowell, Shabalala Self, Molly Larkey, Matthew Ronay. And really, these are objects and these artists, it's meant to challenge, I think, people and push them a little bit to sort of say, well, what is the O'Keeffe in that? How are you making these connections? And a lot of it, I think, will come down to ideas of innovation, but also ideas of color and just really this use and this magical space that I think O'Keeffe did really well in, is this moving between figuration and abstraction and works that you can't really see a body in, but it was there at some point. And how are artists doing that now, or how are they actually keeping the body present? Artists like Shabalala Self, things like that. So this exhibition is deep on my mind right now because it opens in 2 months. I should be writing labels right now, so I will be doing that later, but it's something that, again, is an exciting moment also for Crystal Bridges, because in the 6 years that the museum has been open, most of the temporary exhibitions have been shows that have come from other museums, just because the museum was busy being opened and growing. So now that we're able to start organizing and curating our own shows, it's a nice moment to really think about what that next 6 years, what that next 10 years looks like. Another project and thing that is really deep on my mind at Crystal Bridges is a space called The Momentary. So in 2012, a Kraft cheese processing plant that had been in Bentonville for a really long time, Kraft moved out. But the processing plant was still there. And then around 2015, Crystal Bridges brought this building to turn it into a center for contemporary art. So we are in the process. This is what it looked like. Sorry, it's very blurry, but very much a factory building, one that has had many different additions onto it. And these are some renderings of what it will look like now. So very much trying to keep the aesthetic and not have it transform too much, but really making it a space where visual arts, performing arts, culinary arts, everything sort of lives together. And so thinking through the visual arts programming aspect of that, there will also be an artist residency component, which is even something that we're launching now before the building opens, but really this idea of how do you bring artists in to have a conversation not only with the building, but with each other, with the public, but also how do you have those conversations between a chef and a visual artist, or a chef and a choreographer? Like, where are those spaces that those conversations can exist and live? So we are at the point now that the only way you can get into the building is sort of with a hard hat and with the construction team. So it's really in that stage, but if all goes well, which hopefully it will, we'll open by February 2020. And so really thinking about artists and projects and how do you sort of continue to have programming that is along the same lines as Crystal Bridges, because we're one institution in one place, but also each space has its own beauties and challenges, because I think there's some things that we'll be able to do at the Momentary that the space at Crystal Bridges doesn't allow. And similarly, the Momentary is not going to have a lot of blank white walls. So what does that also mean, and how do you have those conversations, and what does it mean to have projects that exist at both locations as well as sort of the mile between, and really trying to think about how to the next stage of what that development looks like and feels like, and sort of continues down this idea of always having artists at the center and the core of what we're thinking in these conversations. Also really blurry, but that's an image that's sort of one of the loading dock exits we're doing is sort of adding on like a glass structure that's meant to be sort of like a meeting room, but also something that stands as like a beacon. So it's always lit up and always activated, so it really draws your attention to the space. So that's really what I had, but I thought we could sort of open it up. I don't know if there are questions or if there's any sort of burning topic that anyone wants to think about or talk about together. And there's a mic.
Thank you so much for that. You mentioned it a bit, and I'm so curious what it's like for you politically doing the work that you're doing, living in the Ozarks during this political moment. I know it was a hard move. Can you talk more about maybe audience interactions and things like that?
Sure. So I moved in September of 2016. So for the November 2016 election, I voted in Bentonville because my ID was expiring. So I moved and I went, and I was standing in line it was a church, like a lot of places where you go to vote, and was standing in line with a lot of people. Everyone got there. We all were there very early. People of all different backgrounds, ages. Behind me, there was a woman with her young daughter who had, I don't know, I think her shirt said future president or something. It was that sentiment. And then there were some older people, and we were all sort of chatting, and things were going slowly. Equipment wasn't working, so people were starting to get a little restless, but in that very polite Southern way of getting restless. And so people started talking to each other. And one of the women in line, an older woman, she said, you know, I prayed about it, but I have to vote for him because that's what I've always done. My husband will do it, so that's what I have to do. So hearing those conversations, then seeing the woman with her daughter who is excited to be president, so assuming she's excited to vote for what she's thinking is the first female president, seeing those things sort of collide in that one space, I think is a good representation of what it feels like, at least politically for me. I think, you know, museums are spaces, particularly I think curatorial and programming space, people who work are very open and sort of liberal and always open for ideas. So I think that feels like a very safe space. And then everyone who comes into the museum, because Crystal Bridges, as I mentioned, was opened in 2011. So you have people who are in the town who saw the museum coming up from the ground, and they have a very strong sense of ownership and support. So they enjoy going along with us on the rides that we're taking. When I first started, there was one of those sort of member meet and greets, and this older couple was like, oh, we're glad you're here. You can explain contemporary art to us. I was like, I don't know if I can, but I will try. But just this like excitement and desire. So it's this place where people are willing and excited to learn and to sort of understand the shows and the projects that we're doing. But it's also a place that is very much in the South and in a state that is conservative. And so as a curator there, I don't necessarily feel the pull institutionally. Like, I've not been told yet, we'll say, but I've not been told you can't do this show or we can't work with this artist because it's challenging. It's more of, okay, how are we going to talk about this? What are the connections we're going to make? How are we going to sort of open people up to this idea? Because, right, you're never going to make a show that speaks to everyone or everyone likes, but you can make a show that you hope people at least understand. So even with that conversation about, well, is Soul of a Nation too political? It says Black Power in the title. What does that mean? To really open it up and sort of have these conversations be about, yes, this was a political time that the show starting in 1963 was coming from, and yes, this is a situation that our country hasn't solved, right? It's not as if there aren't still Black people who live in this country that feel like the country hates them. Like, you know, that's not a conversation that we've stopped having and everything's been solved. So to be able to have that exhibition and say that, but to then also say, but look at this work. It's interesting, it's important, it's in conversation with these artworks that you've already gotten used to and these artists that you already know. So what are the other things and the connections we can make?
Concerning the O'Keeffe show that's coming up, what is the artist that maybe you helped find or is the most unknown that you're excited about bringing into your institution?
So, you know, Chad and I, we did a lot of studio visits, and there are some artists in the show who I've known for a while. So artists like Jennifer Packer and Mordell Milan, I've known them from my time at the Studio Museum. But there are other artists. There's a woman named Monica Kim Garza who is based in Atlanta, and her work is something that I'm really excited about. And she has a gallery she's shown, I think, in different places in Atlanta, but really not anywhere, definitely not in Bentonville, and definitely not where we are. So there's excitement around that. I'm also excited because our education team has done a really great job of reaching out to the artists. So out of the 20 artists, 11 of them are going to come throughout the run of the exhibition to do programming, and they're all doing some sort of engagement with either kids or students or just a lot of people. So it's a nice moment to really also not only have their work there, but to have the artists present to really have those conversations continue.
Hi. So many of the pictures you showed, there were many walls with colors. So, you know, I think that using colors in the walls is quite challenging. It's not easy, but it seemed worked pretty well. So I wonder how, in your process, when you're curating, how you come to the conclusion, like, we need color for this wall, and then when you decide that, how you decide what color, how you...
Yeah. That's a good question. So I've had two very different experiences with that. So at the Studio Museum, we were a small team, and the curators, we made a lot of those decisions with our exhibition manager, who was sort of helped us sort of see those things. But sometimes with color, it was, oh, that's a great color in that work. What if we pull it out to sort of have a wall that features it or talks about it and engages with the work, to really always not distract from the work, but to be something that's additive. At Crystal Bridges, we have an exhibition designer. Her name is Jessie. She's fantastic. She's trained as an architect, but has sort of done this and taken this into the museum world and field. So she's the one that we sort of work with when we have a checklist to say, okay, to transform what is the temporary gallery. So the images were Soul of a Nation, where that's our temporary gallery where we change the show 3 times a year. And each time it looks different. So we work with her to think about colors and where walls should go and how to, again, have it be something that's additive, because you don't want to distract from the work with the design, but you want it to be something that really helps people see what you're trying to do or helps guide them through the space in a particular way.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. That was great. You kind of touched on it a little bit, so I don't mean to be redundant. I'm sorry. You said the Walton family, Walton as in Walmart?
Yes.
And are you concerned at all about their reach or their influence in terms of curatorial choices or anything else institutionally?
So the Crystal Bridges is in Bentonville. So Bentonville is the home of Walmart. It's where the first Walmart was. It's where the big headquarters of Walmart are now. It's where I think probably some of the best kept Walmarts are, because if you're that close to headquarters, things are going to be well stocked. And so our current Alice Walton, who's our founder and board chair, so she's the chair of our board, is very much sort of involved, like most board chairs, in sort of our approving and hearing about our exhibition programming and collecting and all of that. But it's, I think, you know, Alice is a collector herself. That's how the museum started, was founded with her sort of own collection that she gifted to the museum. So she has that interest in that eye, but she also is very trusting of her staff and the team, and really lets us do, like the whole board does, really lets us explore and grow and try new things. So I think it was nothing that I was concerned about, and it's not been an issue, because I think, you know, they have a lot to deal with even there, and then there's also the foundation that does a lot of their philanthropic stuff. So there are so many different things that the museum is additive to Bentonville, but not something that is so much controlled or part of that same conversation.
Thank you. I keep seeing, like, especially in the past couple of years, this exhibitions by kind of women of color, especially Black women, that have been kind of missed, or this idea of like rediscovered, like you mentioned with the exhibition at the Whitney. There was a show of Senden and Goody that was touring, and the Howardina Pindell show now at the MCA, but also looking at the pattern and seeing that it's mostly curated by other women of color that put like a light on this and kind of centering the experience, but that doesn't seem to be a pattern in larger institutions, I guess. Like, it seems to be very specific curators with very specific agendas, where it doesn't feel like they're being tokenized, but they're actually being centered. And I wonder what you have to say about that, and what do you think your work does in relation to that kind of pattern that is happening?
So I think I'm going to take that in two parts. I think the part about this idea of, you know, when there is that feeling of, oh, this artist has recently been discovered, but it's also discovered by who, right? Like, who is the person that we're giving that power to? And the fact that many of these artists have been working and people know who they are, particularly, and have been supporting their work. But it's that discovery, that moment when it gets to these larger, you know, mainstream institutions. So I think that's one part about that, sort of how we talk about that and how we use that language. But this idea, right, you're right. I think part of when we talk about diversifying the art world, we're also talking about not just diversifying the artists, but also diversifying curators, diversifying museum staff, diversifying museum goers, really everything. So I think the more that you are able to have people from all different backgrounds who are interested in working in museums and curating and having these critical conversations, you're going to continue to see works and shows of artists of these backgrounds. That's not to say that, you know, only Black artists, Black curators can curate Black artists and all of those things. That's not what it should be like at all. It should be really a space where conversations can happen and people of all backgrounds can really have a deeper understanding. But I think until we get to a point where these shows don't feel so special in a way, or so, they will always be important, but when they don't feel so like, oh my gosh, it's finally happening, this is amazing, when it's like, all right, it's time, this was good. When we get to that point, I think these conversations will help be a little more nuanced, but at this point we are still at that moment where it's like, oh my goodness, of course Howardina Pindell needed a show, and of course Naomi Beckwith and Valerie Cassell Oliver are the two that are doing it, right? So it's like, how do we continue to have these conversations, but also to continue to have it not be so much of a discovery for people? I think it's something that I think a lot about with my work. So I think, you know, one of the challenges of going from an institution like the Studio Museum, which is small and very mission specific, so art and artworks inspired by African American artists living, you know, all across not even black artists living all across the world, sort of the mission, to an institution that doesn't have such a specific mission, but is looking at American art and invite you to celebrate the spirit of American art and combine architecture, art, and nature in one space. So, right, there's not that same spoken commitment in the mission, but it is part of what my curatorial practice is. So this idea of how do you bring voices that maybe aren't always in the museum or sometimes left out of the conversation into a place where that conversation is happening, right? So what does it mean in the contemporary galleries to think about putting a work by an artist named Haynes next to a Mark Rothko work, right? So like, how do we take these works and these artists who were doing the work around the same time and making important works, but putting them in this narrative and the history that is more told?
Hi. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to your struggles in that transition between the studio museum and then going to a much larger institution. Because I think one of the things that stood out to me in the presentation is that you are coming from a space where you're allowed to express maybe, or maybe more align with some of your specific ideals or interests. And then what is it like then for you to go to that larger space and then encounter a pushback?
And I think it's, the pushback hasn't been, there's not too much of a pushback, right? Because I think, you know, if you know me and you know the work that I do, if you hire me to come to your institution, you know the work that I do, you know what I'm interested in. And I sort of see it as more of a, for me, a personal challenge, right? Like, how can I grow as a curator? How can I do the work that I want to do? How do I go from an institution that everyone sort of co-signs and is all about it and understands it to a place where wants to be there and wants to really be more inclusive and more diverse? And so how can I take what I know and try to help push that conversation? So that's really was one of, I think, for me, a challenge. I think going from an institution that has about 50 employees to an institution that has close to 300 employees, there are just challenges in scale, remembering people's names, remembering how to get from place to place, like, so those, just, which would happen, I think, any institution, but then also going from an extremely diverse city like New York to a place like Bentonville, which has actually a good amount of diversity because of the fact that there are many large companies there that bring people in from all over, but how do we get those people into the museum more, right? Like, how do we make them feel more welcome in this space? So being able to have more diversity on the museum staff and in the museum team, I think helps bring that along a little bit. But yeah. Great. If there are no more questions, thank you all so much.